Okay, so let's talk about schedules of reinforcement or schedules of punishment. We talk about a schedule. This means like when something's going to happen, right? This class has a schedule. It happens on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. So we're going to talk about when reinforcement or punishment happens. For simplicity, I'm just going to say schedules of reinforcement, but this also applies to punishment as well. So we can have continuous schedule of reinforcement. With a continuous schedule of reinforcement, this means that every time the operant response is made, we're going to reinforce it or punish it. So every time that a kid gets an A on a paper, we're going to say, great job. Every time that the dog poops on the floor, we're going to kick it or say, no, that's bad. Every time. So with continuous, every behavior is reinforced. This produces the fastest learning. Think about it. With continuous reinforcement, every time they make the operant response, it's associated with the outcome, right? So every response is an operant one. This can be expensive though. If you're training a dog and you want it to come or to sit or to roll over and you give it like a piece of bacon or a treat every time that it makes the correct or the desired response, you're going to have to feed it a lot, right? So this can be expensive. It also leads to rapid extinction. So once the behavior stops producing the outcome, then the animal is very quickly able to identify that the association has changed. The situation isn't the same, so I'm not going to bother making the same response anymore. Does that make sense? We can contrast this with partial reinforcement, where we don't reinforce or punish every single behavior. We reinforce the behavior some of the times. This produces slower learning because the association isn't as strong. Am I going to get the outcome because I produced the behavior now? Maybe, maybe not. It's not a perfect correlation, so it's going to take longer for the organism to pick up on the association. This is way cheaper though. We don't have to reinforce or punish something all the time. And because of this, we're not doing it every time. It's more resistant to extinction. If you didn't get the reinforcement this time, does that mean that you're not getting the reinforcement anymore? Or is it just that you didn't happen to get it this time, you could get it in the future, right? With the continuous, it's obvious. With this, it's less. So something that you can do if you're trying to train dogs, cats, or people is start with a continuous schedule, right? Reinforce them every time they make the response to get the learning to happen quickly, and then once they're demonstrating the behavior a lot, then you can switch to partial to save money and to produce an association that's not going to be as fast to become extinguished over time. Does that make sense? Okay, so we can also talk about difference between interval and ratio scales. So with an interval scale, the thing that's important is the time. Think about a time interval. How much time has to pass before you produce the behavior and the reinforcement will be there again. So with an interval schedule, the reinforcement follows the first behavior after some time interval has passed. You all have the food cards, right? So if you're hungry and want to get to lunch, you can go to the cafeteria, and this is set up on an interval schedule of reinforcement. The cafeteria is open every day, I don't know, at 11 or 12, but anyway, if you go after 11 within that certain time frame, you can get reinforced for using your card, right? Now imagine that you could only use your card for lunch once a day, right? Sometimes you might be really hungry and you could use it twice, but let's imagine that you can only use it once. Once you get the lunch one day, you have to wait about 24 hours until that reinforcement is going to be available again. Does that make sense? So you can get reinforced for using your card, but it's dependent on the time, right? You have to go after 11. Ratio scales, on the other hand, it's not the time that passes that's the important thing for determining when a reinforcer is going to be available. It's the amount of behaviors that matter. So reinforcement follows some number of behaviors. Think about the people that work in Salt and Oven, selling tops and maps and postcards. I don't know about those of you who appear more Turkish, but like me, when I go, it's obvious that I'm a foreigner. And when I walk around, they're always asking, oh, hey, do you want to buy a present for your kids? Oh, do you want to buy a map? Do you want to buy a postcard? It doesn't matter the amount of time that passes for them to get reinforced for coming up to someone and asking them to buy, right? What matters is the number of people that they ask. So they ask him, maybe not. They ask him, maybe not. They ask her, she buys, right? It's the number of behaviors that will produce greater amounts of reinforcement or punishment, right? The more behaviors you engage in, the more times you ask someone to buy a top or a map, the more often you're going to sell it and get that reinforcement. Is that clear? So with interval, it's the time that matters. With ratio, it's the number of behaviors that matters. Of course, according to Thorndike's law, operant conditioning is situationally dependent. So this depends on the situation. If you want to get reinforced for using your card to get lunch, you need to go to the cafeteria. Actually here that's not completely true because you could go to Cafe Crown instead, right? But you need to go to either Cafe Crown or the cafeteria. If you came to my office and handed me your card and wanted some food, you'd be out of luck. Same thing with selling tops. You need to sell the tops and the maps to people who might be interested in getting a souvenir, who might be interested in learning about where things are. Sultanahmet, since there are a lot of tourists in this area, this is a good place to do it. So this works in Sultanahmet. This might not work inside of a mosque. This might not work here at Istanbul Shehir University. All right, fixed versus variable schedules of reinforcement. With a fixed schedule of reinforcement, you know exactly when reinforcement's going to be available. And this could be knowing exactly how much time has to pass or how many behaviors you have to do to get the reinforcement. The important thing is you can predict exactly. So with the cafeteria, you know food is available every 24 hours. This is fixed. It doesn't vary at all. Does this make sense? This is different from a variable schedule of reinforcement. As the name can clue you, with a variable schedule, you can't predict exactly when the reinforcement's going to be available. So with the example of the person selling maps in Sultanahmet, this is a variable schedule of reinforcement, right? You might sell one to him, not to her, not to her, but to her, right? You might sell one 5 times in a row and then not sell any 20 times in a row. There's variability. It could be that there's some fixed schedule. If every 5th person bought one, you would know then that it's fixed, right? But every 5th person doesn't buy one, so this is variable. Again, both of these depend on the situation as Thorndike's law dictates. We can draw up another outcomes matrix and talk about how these different types of schedules interact. So we can look at whether we're using an interval schedule or a ratio schedule, and also whether we're using a variable schedule or a fixed schedule. Okay, so I'm breaking my promise here. Who can come up with an example of a fixed interval schedule of reinforcement?
Taking a medicine.
Taking the medicine, right? So let's imagine that you have headaches every day, and you need to take the medicine every 12 hours. So after 12 hours, you're starting to feel bad again, and if you take the medicine, boom, you're feeling good again. If you take the medicine before the 12 hours is up, it's not going to have this effect, right? Because you're already feeling okay. So the reinforcement is available after a fixed interval of time. The example of the cafeteria is also an example of a fixed interval schedule. How about a variable interval schedule? What behaviors are reinforced after some interval of time passes, but you don't know exactly how long that time is going to be?
I don't know, maybe this is related to chance, but when you gamble.
Okay, when you gamble. Does the amount of time matter when you gamble? I mean, certainly there is some variability of when you're reinforced in time when you're gambling, but does it matter if I wait an hour or if I wait 10 hours, does this change the likelihood that I'm going to get reinforced for making a bet?
Maybe if we can change the name time to try, because time passes as you try.
Yeah, so if we change time from time to trying, we're not looking at the time anymore, we're looking at the number of behaviors.
But doesn't time pass?
And time, you're absolutely right. Time does pass, right? The more time you spend doing something, the more time passes. Yes, but the thing that matters when you're talking about gambling, when you get reinforced, it doesn't matter how much time has passed. It matters how many responses you've made, right? If you guys all know what a slot machine is. You put the money in, you pull this lever, and these cylinders go around, and you need cherries to line up or something. It doesn't matter if you do one pull and then walk away for an hour, and then another pull, and then walk away for 24 hours, right? Then what matters is how often you're pulling.
But if it is necessary, we have to do it.
If it's necessary, what do you mean?
I mean, if you don't, if you are not, if it is not necessary for you, you didn't do it. You will not do it.
Well, you have to do the pull in order to potentially be reinforced, right? But when you're reinforced, it doesn't depend on the time. There's some random number generator that determines whether or not you win or not, right? And this isn't dependent on the time. If it was dependent on the time, people would figure this out, and they would go pull this at 11:01, right? If they figured out that at 11:01 I was going to win, right? But it doesn't matter. You can pull it at 11:01 maybe one day and win, and 11:01 on a different day and you won't win. So the gambling, it's not dependent on time. It's dependent on how often you're doing it. And the more often you gamble, the more often you'll win.
I
Yeah.
have an example. I don't know if it's correct.
Okay.
You know, when we apply for the residence permit on the website, you have to check the website every time to see if there is a seat available in the ambience in the place. Okay, so you have to. It's like it depends on time. You have to direct the.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good example. So if you want to get a residence permit, you need to sign up for a time on the website. And at different times, there are different numbers of availabilities, right? And if you press it, refresh, it doesn't necessarily change. What matters is not how quickly you can press refresh, but how much time has elapsed to allow a new spot to open up. So that's a great example. I have a grosser example, and that's going potty. Relieving oneself is a primary reinforcer. You have to go to the washroom. This is uncomfortable. You go to the washroom. This is negative reinforcement, right? You're getting rid of an uncomfortable feeling. So imagine, we all like negative reinforcement. When should we go to the potty? If I went to the potty right now, I wouldn't get that negative reinforcement because I don't have to go, right? So what matters is that I do this when I need to go. And what's going to determine when I need to go? It's not how often I go into the bathroom, it's how much time has passed, right? If I allow more time to pass, then I'm going to be more likely to need to go. I'm going to be more likely to get reinforced for that behavior. Does that make sense?
Give us another example.
We can talk more if you need more examples after class, but we got to get through this. All right, a fixed ratio scale. This is like commission sales. Imagine that you have a job and you're paid every 10 items that you sell. When I was in America, they had this program called Cutco. And they would pay the students after every 10 times that you made a sale, then you would get a commission check, right? So it didn't matter how quickly you could get those 10 times. What mattered is when you got the 10 times, right? So someone could get 10 sales in one day and they would get the reinforcement. Someone else could take the whole year to get those 10 sales and they would get the reinforcement. The key thing here is not the time that passes, but how quickly you can get to the 10 sales, right? The continuous schedule, where you're getting reinforcement every time you do something, this is a special case, right? You know that you're going to get reinforced whether you do it right now or whether you wait 10 minutes or whether you wait 10 years, right? It's continuous. Every time you do it, you get reinforced. Finally, the variable ratio, the biggest example of this is gambling. So you put the money in, you don't know if you're going to get reinforced right now. But the more often you put money in and do this, the more chances you have of winning. Now the casinos are set up so that your chances of losing overall are greater than the chances of winning. But people think that they're lucky. People think that they're going to beat the system, so let's do this anyway. Yes?
I would say football should play.
I'm sorry?
Football.
What about football?
Tem points. Ambitions. Football.
Yeah, so with football, you get more points the more shots you take, right? The more shots that you take, the more likely that one of them is going to make it. You don't have to like wait, okay, let's let 5 minutes go by and now take a shot, right? Take shot after shot after shot if you can. Does that make sense? Good example. The variable ratio produces the most frequent, consistent responding that's the most resistant to extinction. And think about it. You're gambling and you haven't won 20 times, but you know next time you might win, right? And the faster you gamble, the faster you might get to that point where the behavior is the right one, it's the operant response, and it produces the outcome, right? So because of this, because you're not sure when it's going to win, and what matters is how fast you can do the behavior, this produces very high rates of responding and very resistant behaviors. All right, so interval is after a certain amount of time. Ratio is after some amount of behaviors. With fixed, you know exactly when you're going to get the reinforcer. And with variable, you're not exactly sure. You might have some idea. Like on average, it takes 24 hours for the cafeteria to open, but some days they might open up early. Have any of you guys eaten before they've officially opened? So I have. I've been there like a couple minutes before the starting time, and I've been able to eat, which suggests that there is a little bit of variability there. All right, shaping. So some of you guys may have seen this video on YouTube. There's this little squirrel, and he water skis. It's really, really cute. If you have free time, Google YouTube water skiing squirrel, and you'll see this dude. How do you get a squirrel to water ski more often? I mean, with operant conditioning, the idea is that we're going to reinforce or punish some behavior that's already there, right? But with squirrels, you don't see like a squirrel just on its own, like hop on some skis and go water ski. So how do you get a squirrel to water ski if it never produces this response on its own normally? Answer, shaping. What shaping? Think about clay. You want to make a pot, right? You have clay. What do you need to do to the clay? You need to shape it. Right? What is this involved with shaping clay? How many of you have ever made like a vase or something with clay? Have that little wheel that turns? You start with this block of clay and you modify it a little bit at a time, right? It starts off not looking like a vase at all. But you take away some of it, and then it starts looking a little bit more round. And then you take some of it away from the inside, and then it starts looking more like a vase. We can use operant conditioning in a similar way. We can reinforce behaviors that approximate water skiing. We could go to a park, and we could leave some water skis down on the ground. Are there squirrels in Istanbul? I haven't seen any. I don't know, go someplace where there are squirrels. Then you can leave skis on the ground. And eventually the squirrels, they're wandering around. At some point they're going to get close to the water skis. They're probably not going to jump on it and go woohoo. But they might get close to it. And what should you do? If you wanted to water ski, you needed to get close to the skis, right? So you can throw it some popcorn when it gets close to the skis. And what should this increase? It should increase some behavior if it's reinforcing, right? It should increase the likelihood that what behavior is produced? Going closer to the skis, right? Now it should be coming to the skis more often. And then once you have it going around the skis, You might not reinforce it for going near the skis, but only reinforce it when it actually physically touches the ski. Does this make sense? Because sometimes when it's close, it's going to accidentally touch the ski. So then we can reinforce that. And if this is reinforcing, what's going to happen more often? It's going to touch the ski more often, right? So then what do? It's touching the skis, but you don't want it touching the skis, you want it water skiing. So then you might wait until it actually stands on the skis, and then reinforce it. And then it'll be standing on the skis more often. And then you can have something that pulls the skis ever so slightly, and you reinforce the squirrel when it stays on, right? And then you pull it into the water and do the same thing, reinforce it when it stays on, and then you've got a water skiing squirrel. I should mention with the shaping, you can use shaping to manipulate children and spouses. It's easier to manipulate children than it is to manipulate spouses, because the kids, they're not picking up on the fact that you're manipulating them as easy as spouses or friends are, right? So if you're going to use shaping with adults, be careful with how you do it, because if they figure out that you're manipulating them, they could get mad. There's an example of shaping on a television show. If you go to YouTube and look for shaping, you'll find this video where this guy gives, I think it's his girlfriend, chocolates every time that she shuts up. So they're watching a movie, she starts to talk, she stops. He gives her a chocolate, right? So he's using operant conditioning to make her bother him less. Okay, finally, superstitions. Sometimes good things happen without us causing it, right? Like I'll be walking along the street and oh, there's 5 liras. This is a good thing, right? It's possible that we did something and we make an association between the thing that we did and this outcome, even though it didn't have a direct relationship. This often happens in sports. So often you'll see like baseball. With baseball, the players, they do these very elaborate routines before they go up to bat. You know, they scratch this arm, and they scratch this arm, and they wipe their brow, and then they go up to bat. Now, how does this happen? Well, if one day they go up to bat and they scratch their arm before, and then they get a hit, even though this might have had nothing to do with it, they might think that it did, right? And by thinking that it did, what should you do the next time? Okay, I'm going to scratch again and do this. So you see some very odd things. Michael Jordan, he wore these shorts that he used to wear in college during all of his professional NBA games because he had this superstition. He did well in college wearing these shorts, so it's not that his practice made him so good, it's these magical shorts, right? So he continued wearing these shorts in the professional. So maybe if you wear mismatched socks and then take my exam, and you do really well, you might think, oh, these are my good luck socks, and then you'll wear them again in the future. All right, when I talked about food aversions, I mentioned some results that were related to both classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Remember when I talked about the dingoes, I said that they eat this poisoned meat? And what does the poisoned meat make them do? It makes them feel nauseous. It makes them sick, right? So the dingo gets sick. And then later, the dingo gets sick when it smells the sheep. So then it stays away from the sheep. Which part of this did classical conditioning produce, and which part did operant conditioning produce? So two possibilities. Did classical conditioning make it nauseous when it smells the sheep, or did it make it stay away from sheep? Classical conditioning. Yeah, so when it gets nauseous around sheep, this is due to classical conditioning, right? It's this automatic reflexive response. So I smell the sheep, yuck, ugh. Now, this is where operant conditioning comes in, right? It engages in some behavior. It got close to the sheep. It felt nauseous. So what can it do? It can stay away from the sheep. It will reduce the likelihood of being by the sheep. So when I talked about the Goldschlager, I said I get nauseous when I have cinnamon-flavored alcohol. This is the result of classical conditioning. It's It's this automatic feeling that I have when I taste the liquor. My decision not to have that liquor anymore, this is operant conditioning, right? I've learned that the result of this behavior, drinking this stuff, produces a response, produces an outcome that I don't like. So I stay away from it. So if we want to keep in mind the difference between this, we can think about classical conditioning being reflexive, right? We associate these two stimuli together, one of which reflexively produces some response. And by pairing these two things together, then that previously neutral stimuli will reflexively produce a similar response, right? Whereas operant conditioning, it's not reflexive. It's not involuntary. It's something that you have control over, right? Oh yeah, I tasted the sheep before and it made me sick. I guess I'm not going to go buy the sheep today. Oh yeah, I won that one time that I gambled. I'm going to gamble some more, right? This is not a reflex. It's not like someone wins one time and then they just have to anytime they get around the machine. It's something that they're motivated to do. All right, so let's do our next class. What time is it? Oh, okay. This is